Clara Bellamy did not knock. She pushed open that ranch gate with her shoulder, her youngest pressed against her hip, her other hand gripping a bag that held everything she owned in this world, which wasn't much. The men on the porch stopped moving. Nobody spoke. A woman that size, dressed that plain, with 3 children trailing behind her like ducklings through the Montana dust. She walked straight to the center of that yard and said 7 words nobody at Blackthorn Creek Ranch had heard in a long time. "I'm here. Tell me where the kitchen is. If this story moves something in you, please subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels." Now stay with me, because what happens next changed everything for every single person on that ranch. The morning Clara Bellamy decided to answer the notice, she had exactly 11 cents in her coat pocket, 3 children who hadn't eaten a proper supper in 2 days, and a landlady in Red Hollow who had given her El Friday to vacate the room above the harness shop. It was Tuesday. She stood at the small window of that room while the children slept, reading the torn piece of paper she'd pulled from the post outside Hatcher's General Store the afternoon before. The handwriting was plain and direct, the kind a man wrote when he didn't have patience for fancy words. Cook wanted, room provided, fair wages, Blackthorn Creek Ranch. 6 miles north on the Gallatin Road. That was all it said. No name, no promises beyond those 9 words. Clara had read it 4 times already. She'd folded it, put it in her pocket, walked back to the room, fed the children what was left of the bread and salt pork, and told herself she would think about it in the morning. Now it was morning, and her thinking hadn't changed a thing. She needed work. She needed shelter. She needed something solid to stand on before the ground swallowed her children whole. She turned from the window and looked at them. Mason was 10 years old and already trying to be a man about things he didn't fully understand. He slept on his side with one arm thrown over Lily, who was 7, and still small enough that Clara could carry her when she needed to, though she rarely asked to be carried anymore. Samuel was 4. He slept with his mouth open and both fists curled at his chin, and he still called for his papa sometimes in the night without waking up. Clara pressed her hand flat against the wall and breathed. Thomas had been gone 8 months. 8 months since the fever took him in 4 days, 4 days. That was all it required to dismantle everything they had built together. The farm hadn't been much, but it had been theirs. The debts that followed his death were considerable, and the farm went to settle them before Clara had fully understood what was happening. A neighbor, a man she'd trusted, had helped her understand the legal paperwork. She'd signed what he told her to sign. 2 weeks later she understood she had signed away the last piece of land her children would ever have called home. She did not cry about it anymore. She had cried until something inside her went very quiet, and then she'd picked up her children and started moving. Red Hollow was the 3rd town she'd tried. The money she'd arrived with was long gone. 11 cents, and a notice for a cook position on a ranch 6 miles up the road. She woke the children gently, and when Mason looked up at her with that serious expression he'd been wearing since his father's funeral, she told him plainly, "We're going to a ranch today. I'm going to ask for work." "What kind of?" Mason said. "Cattle ranch, I expect." "Do they need a cook?" They put up a notice saying they did. Mason sat up and rubbed his face with both hands. "What if they say no?" Clara looked at her son steadily. "Then we ask somewhere else." She didn't tell him there wasn't really a somewhere else. She didn't tell him about the landlady or about Friday. There were certain weights a 10-year-old boy should not have to carry. And Clara was ferocious about protecting her children from the ones she could still keep off their shoulders. Lily was already awake, listening. "Will there be animals?" she said. "It's a cattle ranch, Lily." Lily considered this with great solemnity. "I like cows," she announced. Samuel stirred, blinked, looked around, and immediately said, "I'm hungry, Mama." "I know, baby." Clara was already moving. "Let's get ourselves ready and we'll find something on the way." What she found was a half-eaten tin of crackers from the bottom of her bag and a wild plum bush beside the road that still had a few bruised fruits clinging to it. The children ate without complaining. Samuel declared the plums excellent. Lily saved 3 crackers in her apron pocket for later, which was a habit she'd developed during the harder weeks, and which broke Clara's heart every time she noticed it. They walked the 6 miles because Clara had no horse and no money for a wagon. The road north was dry and warm, and the Montana sky was enormous and above them, the kind of sky that made a person feel very small and very free at the same time. Clara walked steadily. She'd learned to walk like that, not fast, not frantic, just steady, 1 foot after the other, because if she stopped thinking about the next step, she started thinking about everything else. Mason walked beside her and matched her pace exactly. Lily chased grasshoppers. Samuel rode on Clara's back for the last 2 miles, his arms around her neck and his head drooping with the particular heavy bonelessness of a sleeping child. She carried him without slowing. She saw the ranch before she reached the gate. The main house sat back from the road with 2 long bunkhouses flanking it, a barn behind, cattle pens to the east. There was nothing wrong with the bones of the place. She could see that immediately. The structure was sound, the fencing was substantial, the land rolled out in every direction in a way that spoke of real working range. But the yard was untidy, not ruined untidy, as though the people living here had simply stopped caring enough to maintain it. Gear left sitting, tools not put away, the kind of disorder that came not from laziness but from discouragement. Clara had seen that before. She'd felt it herself. She shifted Samuel higher on her back and pushed open the gate. There were 4 men on the bunkhouse porch. They stopped what they were doing. 1 stopped whittling. 1 stopped mending a harness. 2 stopped a card game and stared at her. Clara walked straight across the yard to the center of it, because walking to the edge of something and waiting to be noticed was a habit she'd decided to give up. "Good morning," she said. "I'm looking for the man who posted the cook notice." "Is he about?" The men on the porch exchanged glances. One of them, broad-shouldered with a sun-darkened face and a jaw that looked like it had made peace with hard weather, slowly set his cards face down on the barrel between them. "That'd be Mr. Whitaker," he said. "Caleb Whitaker." "He's in the barn." "Thank you," Clara said. She turned and walked toward the barn. She heard one of the men on the porch say something low to the others, and she heard 2 of them laugh. And she kept walking because she had learned hard and slowly and well, that the opinion of men on porches was not a thing worth slowing down for. The barn was dim and smelled of hay and horse and working leather. A man was bent over the foreleg of a dark roan horse near the far stall, speaking to it quietly with the kind of patience that took years to develop. He was tall, even bent over, with brown hair that had been pushed back from his forehead by some earlier effort and given up on. His shirt was rolled to the elbows. His hands were large and deliberate. Clara stopped just inside the barn door. "Mr. Whitaker." The man straightened. He turned around, and he looked at her, the whole of her, the way a person looks at something unexpected, and she let him look because she had nothing to hide and no time to pretend she did. She knew what he saw. She knew exactly what he saw. A large woman in a worn dress, with dark hair escaping its pins, and 3 children, arrayed behind her like in a row, standing in his barn doorway without an invitation. She had been looked at like that before. In every town, in every shop, at every door she'd knocked on in the last 8 months. Sometimes the look ended in a door closing. Sometimes it ended in something worse than that, a kind of slow dismissal that left a woman feeling like she'd asked for something she had no business wanting. She stood straight and kept her eyes on his. "My name is Clara Bellamy," she said. "I saw your notice in Red Hollow. I'm here about the cook position." Caleb Whitaker looked at her for a moment that's stretched out just long enough to be uncomfortable. Then he looked at the children. Mason was looking back at him with that level, measuring gaze that he'd inherited from nobody. Clara could identify it, had simply appeared sometime around his father's funeral. As though the grief had burned away whatever childish things used to live in his eyes. Lily had found a cat. She was trying to pick it up. The cat was not cooperating. Samuel had fallen back asleep against Clara's shoulder. Caleb looked back at Clara. "You walked from Red Hollow." "Yes, 6 miles. The road was pleasant." Something moved in his expression, though she couldn't have named it. He pulled a cloth from his back pocket and wiped his hands, slowly, as though he was thinking through something while he did it. "Mrs. Bellamy," he said, "I have to be straight with you. This is a working ranch. The cookhouse handles 14 men at peak season, 8 regular hands right now. Breakfast before sunup, supper by dark, midday meal packed for the men in the field. It's not easy work. I know what cooking for working men looks like," Clara said. "My father ran a boarding house in Billings for 11 years. I worked that kitchen from the time I was 9 years old. You have 3 children, I do. Where would they?" "They work," said. "Mason is 10 and capable. Lily is 7 and thorough. Samuel is 4 and enthusiastic. They will contribute and they will not be a disruption." She paused. "And if that changes, you tell me, and I'll address it." Caleb looked at her again in that same way, not unkind, but searching, as though he was looking for the part of her that was going to complicate things or disappoint him. "The last cook left a month ago," he said. "I noticed the men on the porch looked like they'd been missing proper meals." "What made you think that?" "Their faces," Clara said simply. "A man who's been eating cold biscuits and bad coffee for a month looks a certain way." The ghost of something, almost a smile, moved across Caleb Whitaker's face and was gone. "The cookhouse is in poor condition," he said. "The stove needs work. The stores are low. I'll need a list of what you have and access to whatever budget you use for provisioning. I can make do with less than most people think is possible, but I need to know the honest truth of what's available." He studied her. "You're not going to ask me what the wages are. I'm going to ask you what the room situation is first," Clara said. "My children need a safe, dry place to sleep. That matters more to me than the wage number." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "There's a small room attached to the cookhouse," he said. "It's basic. Basic is fine. It's small for 4 people." "Mr. Whitaker," Clara said, and she heard the edge of something tired come into her own voice, not defeat. Just the plain factual weight of a woman who had been surviving on sheer will for 8 months. "I have been in a room above a harness shop in Red Hollow for 3 weeks, with 3 children and 1 window and a landlady who expects us gone by Friday." "Small is fine." He was silent for another moment. Then he said, "Wages are $12 a month with room and board." Clara calculated quickly and privately. It was enough. Enough to set aside something small, enough to feed her children properly, enough to stop the free-falling sensation she'd been living with since Thomas died. "That's acceptable," she said. "Can you start tonight?" "Yes, Mr. Whitaker," she said. "Tonight?" He nodded once, slowly, as though he'd just made a decision he wasn't entirely sure about and was choosing to commit to it anyway. "I'll have Elias show you the cookhouse," he said. "Thank you." She turned to go, then stopped. She turned back. "I'll need someone to help me bring my family's things from Red Hollow. I don't have a wagon." Caleb Whitaker looked at her, and then at the sleeping child on her shoulder, and then at the little girl who had finally managed to capture the barn cat and was now holding it with an expression of complete triumph. "I'll send a man with the wagon this afternoon," he said. "I appreciate that," Clara said. She shifted Samuel's weight. "I'll start in the cookhouse now and send Mason to meet the wagon when it comes." She walked back out into the yard. The men on the porch were watching. She stopped at the foot of the porch steps and looked up at the broad-shouldered one who had pointed her toward the barn. "I'm Mrs. Bellamy," she said. "I'll be your cook starting tonight. Supper will be at 6 o'clock. If any of you have a particular difficulty with a food and allergy or something you truly cannot eat, tell me now. Otherwise, I'll be feeding you what I think is best, and I expect you to show up on time." The man blinked. The others echoed it, one after another, with varying degrees of surprise. Clara nodded. "Good." She looked at Lily, who was still holding the cat. "Lily, put the cat down." Lily put the cat down. They followed their mother across the yard to the cookhouse. The cookhouse was exactly what Caleb Whitaker had warned her it would be. The stove had a crack in the firebox that would need to be packed with clay before she could trust it. The work table was thick with grime. The shelves held far less than a kitchen, serving 8 men, should hold a sack of flour that had been opened and poorly stored, a small amount of cornmeal, dried beans, coffee that smelled stale, and a collection of tins with no particular organization. The iron pot in the corner was salvageable. The cast iron skillet on the shelf was in good condition, which Clara took as a sign of something a cook who'd loved that skillet once, even if everything else had gone to ruin. She stood in the center of the cookhouse and breathed once, carefully, and then she turned to her children. "Mason," she said. "Yes, Mama, I need firewood, enough to heat this stove for tonight and tomorrow morning. Start with what's in the woodpile behind the barn and stack it close to the door." "Yes, Mama." "Lily, this table needs to be scrubbed. I need you to find a rag and water and work at it until I can press my palm flat on the surface without it coming up dirty." Lily examined the table with the seriousness of someone accepting a significant commission. "I'll do it right," she said. "I know you will." Clara looked at Samuel, who was awake now and looking around the cookhouse with the enormous, undiscriminating curiosity of a 4-year-old. "Samuel." "Yes, Mama, you stay where I can see you, and you do not touch that stove under any circumstances." "The stove is hot?" "Not yet. What can I do?" Clara reached down and picked up a small bucket near the door. "See that pump outside the window? You can carry water. Small amounts. You bring a bucket and you put it here by the door." Samuel's face transformed with the particular joy of a child given real work. "I can do that," he said with great dignity. "I know you can." She let them scatter to their tasks, and then she turned back to the stove and began her honest assessment of what needed to happen before 6 o'clock. The man named Elias Carter appeared in the doorway about 20 minutes later. He was older than the others on the porch, maybe 50, with a face like worked leather and eyes that had seen a considerable amount of the world. "Mr. Whitaker sent me to see if you needed anything," he said. Clara didn't look up from where she was examining the firebox crack. "I need clay or packed mud to seal this before I can build a fire safely. I need someone to tell me if there's more food stored anywhere that I haven't seen yet. And I need to know where your nearest source of fresh meat would be, because there's not enough in these stores to feed 8 men well tonight." Elias leaned in the doorway and looked at her with an expression she would come to recognize over the following weeks, a kind of slow, careful respect that a man like him gave out in very small installments. "There's a steer that's been set aside for butchering," he said. "We just haven't gotten around to it. Can someone do that this afternoon?" "I can. I'll need a good portion of it for tonight's supper." "Yes, ma'am," he paused. "There's also a root cellar behind the main house. It's got more stores in it. Mr. Whitaker might not have thought to mention it." Clara straightened and looked at him directly. "That is extremely useful information, Mr. Carter. Thank you." He ducked his head in something that was almost a bow. "Yes, ma'am." He stayed a moment longer, watching them stack wood with methodical seriousness, and Samuel trot back and forth with his small bucket, and Lily scrubbing the table with an expression of fierce concentration. "Those are good children," he said. "They are," Clara said simply, because it was true and she saw no reason not to say so plainly. After Elias left, she went to the root cellar. It was better than she'd hoped. Onions, potatoes, dried herbs, a crock of lard, 2 jars of preserved tomatoes someone had put up the previous summer. Not abundance, but enough. Enough was all she needed. She built the evening's meal in her mind the way a general builds a plan, resources assessed, timing mapped, contingencies considered. Beef stew with potatoes and onions, heavy on the broth so it stretched. Biscuits, she had enough flour for proper biscuits if she was careful. Coffee that was worth drinking, because a man who'd been drinking bad coffee for a month would notice immediately when it changed. She worked steadily, and the children worked beside her, and the afternoon moved, and somewhere around 4 o'clock, when the smell of the stew had begun to drift out the open window and across the yard, she heard the sounds from the bunkhouse change. Quitter, then stirring, then footsteps. By 5:30, 2 of the hands had found reasons to be near the cookhouse door. By 5:45, all of them had drifted into the area, not asking for anything, just existing in the vicinity of the smell. Clara set Mason to watching the biscuits, and she stirred the stew and did not say anything to the men standing around outside, because she understood perfectly well what they were doing, and it did not require comment. At 6 o'clock, she opened the serving window. "Supper," she said. They filed in. They were quiet in a way that Clara recognized the guarded quiet of people who had been disappointed enough times to be careful about hoping. They took their plates. They sat down. The first bites were taken with that same carefulness. Testing, waiting for the disappointment. It didn't come. She heard the change happen, not loudly, not all at once, but in a series of small sounds. A chair shifting, a long exhale. The particular silence of a man who has stopped thinking about anything except what's in front of him. Elias Carter set his spoon down on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then he looked up at the serving window where Clara was watching and said quietly, in the tone of a man making a genuine confession, "Mrs. Bellamy, I forgot what a real supper tasted like." The room was quiet. Then one of the younger hands laughed, not unkind, just released. The laugh of a man who just realized the tension in his shoulders was gone, and something broke open in the bunkhouse. Some sealed-up thing, and the laughter spread. And voices came up, and the room filled with the sound of people who had been isolated in their exhaustion, and were, just for a moment, not isolated anymore. Clara watched from the serving window. Mason appeared beside her, looking out at the room with the evaluation of a 10-year-old, who had been watching people carefully for 8 months. "They like it," he said. "They do," Clara said. "You knew they would." She didn't answer that directly. Instead, she said, "Go eat your supper, Mason. You worked hard today." She was cleaning the cookhouse at 7:30, after the children were settled in the small room that was theirs. Now their clothes hung on the pegs, Samuel asleep already. Lily reading by the last of the light from the single lamp when she heard footsteps outside, and Caleb Whitaker appeared in the cookhouse door. He stood there for a moment, not coming in, looking at the cleaned and settled kitchen, with an expression she couldn't read immediately. "My men are talking," he said. Clara kept scrubbing the pot she was working on. "Talking about what? About supper?" He paused. "Elias says it's the best meal he's had since his wife passed." That was 4 years ago. Clara didn't say anything. "You managed that with what was in this kitchen?" Caleb said. "The root cellar helped, and Mr. Carter butchered the steer as I asked." "You knew to ask him. He mentioned it was there to be done." "I just moved the timing." Caleb was quiet again. He leaned one shoulder against the doorframe and looked at the cookhouse, the clean surfaces, the organized shelves, the banked fire and the repaired stove, and something in his face shifted. "This kitchen looked like that for a month," he said. "Nobody touched it. Sometimes a thing needs the right person to touch it," Clara said. She didn't mean it as anything except the plain truth, but she saw it land on him differently. She saw it move through his face like weather, moving across open land, and she looked back down at the pot she was scrubbing and let the silence settle. After a moment, he said, "Is the room adequate? For you and the children?" "It's fine. Mr. Whitaker, I told you small was fine." "I meant it." He nodded. "If there's anything you need." "I'll ask Mr. Carter," she said. "He seems to know where things are." "You can ask me," Caleb said. She looked up then, and she found him looking at her with an expression that was perfectly straightforward, not flattering, not angling for anything, just direct and serious and honest. "All right," she said. "I'll ask you." He pushed off the doorframe. "Good night, Mrs. Bellamy." "Good night, Mr. Whitaker." He was halfway across the yard when she heard him stop. She waited. "The men were ready to leave," he said, not turning around. "Before tonight. 3 of them had been talking about it." Clara said nothing. "They weren't talking about it at supper," he said. He kept walking. Clara finished cleaning the pot. She put it on the shelf. She checked the banked fire. She went into the small room and looked at her 3 sleeping children, Mason, with his arms crossed over his chest like a small soldier, Lily with the book face down on the quilt beside her, Samuel with his fists at his chin, and she let herself feel, just briefly, the thing she'd been keeping carefully set aside all day. Not happiness exactly, something more cautious than that. Something more like the feeling of solid ground beneath her feet after a very long time of finding nothing but shifting mud. She blew out the lamp. She did not know yet what this place would become. She did not know what the man in the main house was dealing with, or what the banker coming down the road would say, or what the town of Red Hollow would think about a widow living on a single man's ranch. She only knew that tonight her children had eaten well. Tonight they had a dry room with pegs for their coats. Tonight, for the first time in 8 months, she had not gone to sleep calculating how many more days they could keep going before something gave way completely. That was enough. That was for Clara Bellamy more than enough. She lay down on the narrow cot beside Samuel's sleeping warmth, and she closed her eyes. Outside, the Montana night was very large and very quiet, and somewhere in the main house, a lamp burned late, the lamp of a man who had been carrying a failing ranch alone for too long, who was sitting in the dark of his own exhaustion and listening, perhaps for the first time in months, to a silence that didn't feel quite so empty as it had the night before. Neither of them knew yet what was coming. Neither of them could have imagined the full shape of what those 7 words spoken by a woman in a barn doorway without hesitation or apology had already set in motion. The next morning came fast and cold, the way Montana mornings always did in late summer, when the nights still held on to something that felt like the promise of the hard season ahead. Clara was up before any of them, before the roosters, before the hands, before Caleb Whitaker's lamp came on in the main house window. She had always been a woman who did her best thinking in the dark, in the quiet hour before the world started demanding things from her. And this morning she needed to think clearly because she was stepping into her second day on borrowed ground, and she could not afford a single misstep. She built the fire in the stove from the coals she'd banked the night before. And while the heat grew, she stood at the cookhouse window, with her hands wrapped around a tin cup, and looked out at the yard she had walked into 24 hours ago, with 11 cents in her pocket and 3 children at her heels. She had slept 4 hours. She felt sharp and ready, the way exhaustion sometimes tipped over into something that worked almost like energy. By the time Mason stumbled out of the back room rubbing his eyes, she had coffee on and biscuits in the oven and a pan of salt pork beginning to crisp at the edges. "You didn't wake me," Mason said. "You needed sleep." "I could have helped. You will help," she said. "Starting now. I need the table set for 8, and I need you to know each man's name by the end of breakfast." "Can you do that?" Mason straightened. The sleepiness left his face the way it always did when she gave him something real to do. "Yes, Mama. Good. Lily gets the eggs from wherever they're keeping hens on this place. I saw a hen house behind the barn yesterday. Send her as soon as she's up." She heard Lily's bare feet on the floor before she'd finished the sentence. The girl appeared in the doorway already half-dressed, her hair loose and her eyes bright. Lily had always been the one who woke up glad, who came into each morning as though it might contain something wonderful. And Clara protected that quality in her daughter, the same way she would have protected a flame in a windstorm. "I heard you say hens," Lily said. "Hen house behind the barn. Bring what you find and be polite if you see anyone from the bunkhouse." What does polite look like at 5 in the morning? Say good morning and don't ask too many questions. Lily pulled on her boots with brisk efficiency and disappeared. Samuel appeared 5 minutes later, stood in the middle of the cookhouse, blinking slowly at the activity around him, and then fixed his gaze on his mother with the absolute certainty of a 4-year-old who knew exactly what he wanted. "Is there food yet?" "Almost," Clara said. "Come here and tell me what smells good." He came to stand beside her at the stove, his chin not quite reaching the level of the work surface, his nose working seriously. The bread smell, he decided, and the meat smell. Both of those. "Good nose," he beamed. She gave him a biscuit from the test batch she'd pulled early, a little pale on the bottom, but fine, and he took it to the corner and ate it with the focused reference of a small person who understood. At a bone-deep level, that food was not a thing to rush. The hands came to breakfast in a way that was completely different from the way they'd come to supper the night before. Supper they had approached with caution. Breakfast they came to with speed boots still being pulled on, hats grabbed off hooks, elbows jostling in the doorway because the smell had reached the bunkhouse before any of them were entirely awake, and their bodies had answered the call before their minds caught up. Clara had the food on the table at 5:30 sharp. Eggs, salt pork, biscuits, gravy. coffee so hot it steamed in the cool morning air. Simple food, working food, the kind of breakfast that asked nothing fancy of anyone but put iron in a man's spine before a long day. They sat down, and for a few seconds the only sounds were plates being filled and coffee being poured. Then Elias Carter looked across the table at Mason, who was standing near the wall, watching everything with his arms crossed. "You the boy who stacked that firewood yesterday?" Elias said. Mason stood up a little straighter. "Yes, sir. Good stack. Straight and dry. Where'd you learn to stack wood like that?" "My father taught me," Mason said. "He said if a job's is worth doing, do it so it'll hold." Elias nodded slowly with genuine approval. "Your father was a smart man." Mason's jaw moved. He was. Clara was watching from the serving window, and she saw it, that small flicker of pain and pride that lived together permanently in her son's face when anyone mentioned Thomas, and she watched him absorb it and stay straight. The way she'd taught him, and she felt the particular fierce love for that boy that had no words adequate to it. A younger hand across the table, maybe 19, with red hair and ears that stuck out slightly, leaned over toward Mason. "You know how to ride?" "Some," Mason said carefully. "You want to learn more?" "That depends on who's teaching." The red-headed hand laughed a genuine surprised laugh and looked at Elias. "I like this kid. His name is Mason," Clara said through the serving window, because she wanted them to use it. "Mason," the young hand said, offering the name back like a handshake. "I'm Pete. I'll teach you to ride proper if your mama says it's all right." Mason looked at Clara. Clara looked at Pete and assessed him the way she assessed everything, quickly, thoroughly, without making a production of it. He had an honest face. His hands were calloused from real work. His eyes were direct. "After your chores are done," she told Mason. Mason turned back to Pete with the careful dignity of a boy trying very hard not to show that he was extremely pleased. "After my chores," he confirmed. The kitchen talked after that. Not loudly, not all at once, but with the particular ease of people who had just remembered that talking over a meal was something they used to do and had simply let slip. Clara listened from the serving window and learned things' names, which she attached carefully to faces, quirks and habits, and small pieces of history that told her who these men were underneath the weathered silence. Elias Carter had been at Blackthorn Creek for 9 years. He had been married to a woman named Ruth who died of fever, the same fever that had taken Thomas, and Clara felt that knowledge settle into her chest like a stone she would carry quietly and with respect. Pete Alderman was the youngest by a considerable margin, 18 years old, from a farm in Nebraska, who had come west because the farm had gone dry, and there was nothing left to stay for. He reminded Clara of a puppy who had not yet grown into his feet, all energy and heart and occasional complete catastrophe. There were others: Hank, who was 50 and spoke in 3-word sentences and was the best horseman on the ranch, according to Elias. Dolan, who had a scar along his jaw that he never explained and who Clara noticed always sat with his back to the wall. Roy and Turner, 2 brothers from Texas who finished each other's sentences and had the same crooked grin. Cole, who was quiet in a way that wasn't unfriendly, but was definite, the quiet of a man who had decided at some point that most things didn't need to be said. 8 men. 8 men who had been eating cold, poor meals for a month and who had been, whether they admitted it or not, slowly losing their connection to the idea that this place was worth the effort. Clara understood that perfectly. She had felt it herself, the way hunger and discomfort wore at a person's belief in things. The way an empty table could make a house feel like just a building. By the time breakfast was cleared and the men had headed out to the day's work, the yard was different. She couldn't have pointed to exactly what was different. The same dirt, the same fences, the same morning sky. But there was movement in it, purpose in it, the quality of people who had somewhere they needed to be and intended to get there. Caleb Whitaker appeared at the cookhouse door while she was washing up. He was already dressed for the day: work shirt, boots, hat in hand, and he stood in the door with an expression that was half professional and half something she couldn't immediately name, and he said, "The men are in better shape this morning." "They ate a good breakfast," Clara said. She didn't stop washing. "That tends to help. It's more than that." She glanced at him. He was looking at Mason, who was visible through the window crossing the yard toward the woodpile, with the kind of purposeful stride that made him look, from a distance, like a very small adult. "Your boy," Caleb said. "Elias offered to let him ride fence line today." Clara set down the pot she was holding. "Elias did?" Said the boy had good hands. Offered to take him out after the morning work. He paused. "I told him it was your call." Clara looked through the window at Mason. She thought about how long it had been since her son had had something that was genuinely his, some task or purpose or place that belonged to him rather than being borrowed from other people's lives. "Tell Mr. Carter yes," she said, "and thank him." Caleb nodded. He turned the hat in his hands once. "I also wanted to say what you did with this kitchen yesterday, with what we had that was." He stopped. "It was supper," Clara said. "Mrs. Bellamy, Mr. Whitaker." He looked at her steadily. "It was more than supper." "You know it was." She knew it was. She didn't say anything for a moment. "I'll need to go into Red Hollow for provisions sometime this week," she said. "The stores here won't carry us past Thursday if I'm feeding 8 men properly." "I'll take you Friday," he said. "I have business in town anyway." "I can go with Pete or—" "I'll take you," he said again, and there was something quiet and definite in his voice that made her simply nod and let it stand. He put his hat on. He was almost out the door when Lily appeared from around the corner with her apron held up to form a basket, carrying 14 eggs with the triumphant expression of someone who had just successfully negotiated a difficult treaty. 14, she announced to Caleb, who was directly in her path. "There were 15, but one had a crack, so I left it." Caleb looked at the eggs and then at Lily. "Good thinking," he said seriously. Lily considered him for a moment with those direct, evaluating eyes that she'd inherited from Clara. "Are you the owner?" she said. "I am. My mama made your men eat better." "She did," Caleb said. Lily nodded, as though this confirmed something she already believed. "Good. They looked sad yesterday." She moved past him into the cookhouse. "Mama, I got 14, I heard. Put 'em here." Clara met Caleb's eyes over Lily's head, and for just a moment something passed between them, not words. Not even exactly a feeling, just the shared recognition of what had just happened. The simple unrehearsed truth of it, and then Caleb Whitaker put his hat brim down and walked out across the yard into his morning. The day moved. Clara learned the rhythm of cookhouse the way she learned every kitchen she'd ever worked, by feel, by attention, by understanding what the space wanted to be and working with it rather than against it. She fixed the shelving arrangement so the most used things were closest. She found a better position for the water bucket that cut her steps in half. She organized the stores so she could see at a glance what she had and what she was running short of. She made a list. She was always making lists. It was one of the habits she'd built during the years when money was uncertain, when exactly what you had was the only thing standing between you and the terrible surprise of having less than you thought. Lily stayed close and helped without being asked to, in the easy practical way she had, wiping surfaces, sorting, carrying things from one place to another with the air of someone who found household order genuinely satisfying. Clara watched her daughter and thought, not for the first time, that Lily was going to be a woman of formidable capability, and the world was going to spend a considerable amount of time being surprised by that. Around 10 in the morning, something happened that Clara had not expected. One of the hands, Dolan, the quiet one with the scar, appeared at the cookhouse door. He stood outside it rather than coming in, which was his habit, she was already learning. He held his hat. "Mr. Dolan, my dinner pail yesterday." He stopped. Started again. "I didn't get one. The others went out to the east pasture with their pails and I didn't." He stopped again. Clara looked at him. She understood immediately what had happened in the chaos and busyness of her first day. She had packed 7 midday pails, and there were 8 men, and Dolan had spent his day in the east pasture without food. "Mr. Dolan," she said, and she kept her voice very level and direct, because she understood instinctively that a man like this one would not want sympathy, only honesty. "I made an error yesterday. I didn't have the count right." "That won't happen again." He looked at her. "It ain't a complaint," he said. "I know. But it was my mistake and I'm telling you it won't happen again." She moved to the shelf and cut thick slick bread she'd baked that morning and put it with a piece of the cold salt pork on a plate and held it out. "Eat something now, and tonight your supper will be ready and hot." He looked at the plate. He looked at her. Something moved in his face, that closed, careful face, and he reached out and took the plate. "Thank you, ma'am," he said quietly. Of course, he was gone before she could say anything else. She stood in the cookhouse for a moment after he left, holding the memory of his face, that private, momentary relief, and then she picked up her pencil and added his name to the top of her count list and circled it so she'd remember to be certain first. That afternoon she heard raised voices from the direction of the barn. Not fighting, something more complicated than fighting. She recognized it before she could identify it, the sound of men at the end of their patience, argument born from stress rather than from genuine disagreement, the kind that happened when people were carrying more than they should be carrying alone. She kept working. 20 minutes later, Pete came into the cookhouse looking like someone who had just witnessed something uncomfortable and wasn't sure what to do with the information. "Coffee ready," he said. "It's always ready." She poured him a cup. "Sit if you want." He sat. He wrapped both hands around the cup and stared into it. Clara went back to what she was doing and didn't push. After a minute he said, "Turner and Hank got into it by the barn." "About what?" "About the loan." He stopped, looked up. "You know about the loan?" "No," Clara said. She kept her voice neutral. "Mr. Whitaker owes the Cattleman's Bank in Red Hollow. A considerable amount, the way Turner tells it. Turner says if it ain't paid by October 1st, the bank can start proceedings to take the land." Clara's hands did not stop moving. She finished what she was doing, and then she turned around and looked at Pete directly. "And you're telling me this because..." Pete looked slightly alarmed, as though he hadn't fully thought through his reason for telling her this. "I don't know," he admitted. "I suppose, because it seems like you should know. Because he gestured vaguely at the cookhouse, at the clean shelves, and the organized kitchen and the pot on the stove. Because you just got here." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Alderman," she said, "is Mr. Whitaker a man who would want his financial troubles discussed with his cook?" Pete's ears turned red. "No, ma'am. Then let's keep this between us and let me hear it directly from him if he chooses to tell me." She paused. "But thank you for being honest about it." Pete drank his coffee very quickly and left. Clara stood in the cookhouse after he'd gone and did the calculation she hadn't been asked to do and didn't particularly want to do. October 1st, 6 weeks away approximately, she thought about the yard she'd walked into. The discouragement she'd read in the men's faces, in the untidy gear and the abandoned kitchen and the low stores. She thought about what Caleb Whitaker had looked like that morning, standing in the door with his hat in his hands and something in his eyes that was too controlled to be simple tiredness. She thought about the fact that she was standing in his cookhouse with her children's coats hanging on his pegs, and her children's names known by his men, and her own name being said in a bunkhouse that had been silent and hollow a day and a half ago. She thought about what it meant to be needed somewhere, and what it would mean to lose that somewhere, and what happened to 3 children if the solid ground gave way again before it had a real chance to hold. She picked up her list. She added 3 items to it. Then she went back to work. Supper that night was pork chops with gravy, roasted potatoes, stewed tomatoes from the crock she'd found in the cellar, and fresh bread. Coffee. A dried apple cake that used the last of the sugar, and which she decided was a worthwhile use of it because something sweet at the end of a hard day was not a luxury, it was morale, and morale was a practical matter. The men filed in. The dynamic was different from the first night, less cautious, more settled, the way people are when they've decided to allow themselves to expect good things. They were louder. They argued cheerfully about something that had happened in the east pasture. Dolan, she noticed, did not sit with his back to the wall tonight. He sat at the end of the bench with enough space between himself and the others to be comfortable, but he was there, at the table, present. Mason came in last, behind Elias, walking with a slight stiffness that told Clara he'd spent the afternoon on a horse for the first time in months, and every muscle from his hips to his knees was reminding him of it. She caught his eye. He shook his head very slightly, which meant, "Don't say anything." She looked away and didn't say anything. He sat down next to Elias and served himself with careful dignity, and she heard Elias say, low and matter of fact, good seat today, boy. You've got natural balance. Mason said nothing, but Clara could see his shoulders from across the room, and she watched them change, that small, involuntary change that happened to a person when they were told something true about themselves that they'd privately hoped was true. Caleb Whitaker did not eat in the bunkhouse. He ate in the main house alone, which was his habit, she understood. But that evening, when the meal was done and the men were drifting back toward the bunkhouse in the loose, easy way of people who were full and tired and temporarily at peace with the world, Caleb appeared in the cookhouse. He'd been working late. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, in the particular quality of exhaustion that came from sitting at papers rather than from physical labor, which was a different kind of tired. He stood in the doorway and looked at the dried apple cake that had one slice remaining on the plate. Help yourself, Clara said. He didn't argue. He took the slice and ate it standing at the counter, and she let him eat in peace while she finished the last of the cleanup. I need to speak with you about something, he said. She stilled. She turned around and looked at him. He looked back at her with that directness she was coming to understand was simply the way he was, no wasted movement, no preamble, just the thing itself. The ranch is carrying a debt, he said, bank loan. Due October 1st. She waited. I'm not telling you this so you'll worry, he said. I'm telling you because you're here and you're working here, and you deserve to know the real situation. He set the empty plate down. If the loan can't be paid, the bank can move to take the property. It's in the terms. Clara looked at him steadily. What would it take to meet the payment? A good cattle sale in Billings, which requires the herd to be in better condition than it's currently in, which requires the men to work at a level they haven't been working at. He paused. They worked harder today than they have in 3 weeks. She said nothing. I saw it happen, Caleb said. I was watching and I saw it happen because of last night's supper and this morning's breakfast. He was quiet for a moment. That shouldn't be all it takes, but it was. That's not unusual, Clara said. People work for people who care about them. I care about them. I know you do, she said, but caring about someone and making them feel cared for are two different acts. The second one is what changes things. He looked at her. She held his gaze and did not retreat from it, because she meant it, and she was not a woman who said things she didn't mean, and then looked away from them. What you're building here, Caleb said, and his voice was lower now, careful. It's not just meals. No, Clara agreed. It's not. The silence between them was the kind that required careful handling, not uncomfortable, but not empty either. Full of something that had no name yet and didn't need one yet. There's a man coming from the bank on Thursday, Caleb said finally. His name is Harlan Briggs. He's been looking for reasons to move on this property for 2 years. He picked up his hat from the counter where he'd set it. I want you to know that before he arrives. Why? Clara said. Because Briggs is going to ask questions about who's living and working here. And his questions aren't going to be polite ones. Clara felt the understanding of that land in her chest quietly and certainly. The way she felt most things, not with surprise, but with the particular recognition of someone who had been through enough of the world to know what shape certain problems took before they arrived. I see, she said. I'll handle Briggs, Caleb said. That's not your concern, but I wanted you to hear it from me first. Not from someone in town. Red Hollow is talking, Clara said. It was not a question. Caleb's jaw moved. Some of them are. She looked at him. Does that concern you? What concerns me, he said, is that you hear about it from me and not from a stranger, and that you don't feel like you're in a situation you didn't know you were walking into. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Mr. Whitaker. I walked into a dying ranch with 3 children and 11 cents in my pocket because I had no other options. I am not a woman who is unacquainted with difficult situations. Something in his face shifted. No, he said, I can see that. He put his hat on. He was at the door when she said, Mr. Whitaker. He stopped. Whatever Mr. Briggs asks, she said, the answer is the same. I'm your cook. My children are here. We're doing the job we came to do. That's the whole of it. And it's the truth, and the truth doesn't need to be complicated." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "Good night, Mrs. Bellamy," he said. "Good night." She heard his boots on the yard, and then the sound of the main house door, and then nothing, the particular deep quiet of a working ranch at night when everyone was finally still. She finished in the cookhouse. She checked the fire. She went to the small room where her children were sleeping, Mason still in his boots, which she removed carefully without waking him. Lily curled around her book, Samuel flat on his back with his arms flung wide, claiming all available space with the unconscious certainty of a much larger person. She looked at them for a long time. She thought about Harlan Briggs in October 1st, and a banker who had been looking for reasons for 2 years. She thought about Caleb Whitaker's face in the lamplight, the particular weight in it, the way a man looked, when he'd been carrying something alone for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to set it down. She thought about the men at the supper table tonight, the sound of that room, the talk and the ease, and Dolan no longer sitting with his back to the wall. She thought about how much could change in 48 hours. She thought about how quickly it could change back. She blew out the lamp and lay down in the dark and did what she had always done when the problems were real and large and not yet solved. She thought about tomorrow's breakfast. She thought about what she had in the stores and what she could make from it and how she could make it good and hot and ready, before the men were out of their bunks. Because tomorrow was coming regardless of bankers or debts or what the people of Red Hollow were saying, and the thing she could do, the concrete, solid, real thing she could do, was put good food on that table in the morning and make this place feel, for 8 more hours, like somewhere worth fighting for. That was what she had. That was what she was, and she had learned in the hardest months of her life that what you had and what you were when you used them with everything you had was never as small as the world tried to make you believe. Thursday came the way bad things often did, quietly, without warning, on an otherwise ordinary morning. Clara had been at Blackthorn Creek for 5 days. 5 days that had changed the shape of the ranch in ways that were impossible to measure exactly, but impossible not to notice. The men came to meals on time now. They came cleaned up. Pete had started combing his hair before breakfast, which Elias noted with a straight face and no further comment. Roy and Turner had fixed the hinge on the bunkhouse door that had been broken for 2 months without anyone bothering. Hank had rebuilt the feed storage corner in the barn without being asked. Small things. But Clara knew better than anyone that small things were never small. Small things were what the large things were made of. She was packing the midday dinner pails, 8 of them, Dolan's name written on the side of his in pencil so she never missed the count again, when she heard the sound of a horse and wagon coming up the road from Red Hollow. She looked through the cookhouse window. The wagon was well kept. The horse was expensive. The man holding the reins wore a suit that had no business being on a ranch road, and he wore it the way men wore things that were meant to make other people feel smaller by comparison. Harlan Briggs. She had not needed to be told what he looked like. She had known men like him her entire life, men who arrived in good clothes to deliver bad news, men who had learned to use the language of business and law to perform what was, in plain terms, the act of taking things from people who had less. She kept packing the dinner pails. She heard him tie up at the main house post. She heard the door. She heard Caleb's voice, brief and contained. Then the door closed and the yard went quiet again, except for the ordinary sounds of the ranch. She sent Mason out with the dinner pails at noon. She kept Lily and Samuel close. 2 hours passed. When Caleb came to the cookhouse, she knew immediately from the way he moved, not defeated, but braced, the way a man moved when he was absorbing something and hadn't finished processing it yet. He stood in the door. "He wants to see the books," Caleb said. Clara set down the spoon she was holding. "That's his right, isn't it? As the lender?" "It is." Caleb's jaw tightened. He stopped. Started again. He made some comments about the arrangement here. Clara looked at him. What kind of comments? Caleb was quiet for a moment. He took his hat off and held it, which she had learned was something he did when he was choosing his words more carefully than usual. "He suggested," Caleb said, That a widow living and working on an unmarried man's property was the kind of situation that raised questions. That certain people in Red Hollow had already begun to raise those questions. And that a bank, as a respectable institution, had to consider the reputation of the properties it held loans against. The cookhouse was very quiet. He threatened the loan terms, Clara said. On the basis of my presence here. He didn't use those words. But that's what he meant. Caleb looked at her steadily. Yes. Clara turned and looked at the wall for a moment. Not because she needed to look at the wall, because she needed 3 seconds to feel the full shape of what had just been said to her, feel it without flinching, and then set it aside so she could think clearly. She turned back. "What do you need from me?" she said. Caleb blinked, as though that was not the question he'd expected. "I don't need anything from you. I'm telling you this because I said I would tell you things directly, and I meant it." "All right." She picked up her spoon again. "Then I'm telling you directly that Harlan Briggs came here to find a reason, and he found the one that was easiest to carry. It has nothing to do with the actual state of this ranch, and it has nothing to do with anything I've done wrong, and you and I both know that." Caleb said nothing. "Are the books in order?" she said. "They're in order. Is the herd improving? Every man on this ranch has worked harder this week than the 3 weeks before it." "Then give him the books and let him look at them," Clara said. "Numbers don't care what Harlan Briggs thinks about widows." Something moved in Caleb's face, not quite a smile. But something in the neighborhood of one. "No," he said. "They don't." He was almost out the door when Lily appeared from around the back of the cookhouse and nearly walked directly into him. She pulled up short, looked up at his face, assessed what she saw there with the accuracy that was her particular gift, and said, "Are you in trouble?" Caleb looked down at her. "Working on it," he said. Lily considered this. "My mama fixes things," she said, with the absolute certainty of a 7-year-old who had watched her mother walk into an abandoned kitchen and turn it into the heart of a ranch in less than a week. "She fixed this whole place already. She can probably fix your trouble too." Caleb looked at Clara over Lily's head. Clara looked back at him without any expression she was willing to name. "Go help your brother," she told Lily. Lily went. Caleb put his hat on. He paused. "Mrs. Bellamy, Mr. Whitaker, thank you," he said. It came out like something he'd been holding and had decided to let go. "Go deal with your banker," she said. He went. What happened next, Clara did not witness directly but heard about afterward from 3 separate sources, which was how she knew it was accurate. Caleb Whitaker brought the ranch books to Harlan Briggs and laid them on the table in the main house and stood at them, while Briggs spent 45 minutes looking through every entry, every expenditure, every account ledger going back 18 months. He found nothing wrong. The books were meticulous. Clara would learn later that this was something Caleb had always been rigorous about, the one area where the struggling ranch had never slipped. Because Caleb had understood from the beginning that numbers were a language certain men used to take things, and he refused to give anyone that particular ammunition. Briggs closed the books. According to Pete, who had been nearby doing something he described vaguely as tack maintenance, but which was clearly surveillance, Briggs sat back in his chair and looked at Caleb for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "The loan terms stand as written, Mr. Whitaker, October 1st, full payment." And then he said, "I'd suggest you think carefully about the situation I mentioned." And Caleb Whitaker, who was not a man who did things without thought, looked at Harlan Briggs across the table and said, quietly and finally, "The situation is my ranch and my business, Mr. Briggs. I'd suggest you think carefully about the difference." Pete's description of Briggs's face at that moment was vivid and largely unprintable. But he left. He got in his well-kept wagon with his expensive horse, and he drove back to Red Hollow and the yard of Blackthorn Creek Ranch, watched him go, and then went back to work. Clara heard the wagon leave from the cookhouse. She kept working. She was starting supper roast chicken. Because Elias had told her there were birds in the back pen that were well past their useful age, and she decided that a Thursday that had included Harlan Briggs deserved a roast chicken when she became aware that Lily was being unusually quiet. Lily was never unusually quiet unless something was wrong. Lily, she said without turning around. Silence. Lily Margaret Bellamy. I heard something, Lily said. Very small, very careful. Clara turned around. Lily was standing at the door that opened to the back of the cookhouse, and her expression was the one she wore when she had done something she wasn't sure about, and was waiting to find out how serious it was. What did you hear? I was outside, by the rain barrel. I wasn't trying to listen, but you heard. 2 of the men from town. They came to the post fence. They were talking to Pete. She stopped. What did they say, Lily? Lily looked at her mother with the eyes of a child who understood more than she should have to at 7 years old about the way the world treated certain kinds of women. They said you were bad for Mr. Whitaker, that a woman like you, they said. She stopped again. Say it plain, Clara said. Her voice was gentle but direct. They said a fat widow with 3 children from nowhere had no business living on a decent man's ranch. That people in town were saying things, that it wasn't proper. Lily's face was very still. They said Mr. Whitaker should send you away before it cost him everything. The cookhouse was quiet. Clara could hear the fire in the stove. She could hear Samuel outside at the pump. She could hear her own heartbeat, steady and careful, doing the thing it had learned to do when pain arrived, not avoiding it, not collapsing under it, just absorbing it, the way good wood absorbed a blow. She crossed the cookhouse and crouched down in front of her daughter. Look at me, she said. Lily looked at her. Did what those men said make you believe it? Clara said. Any part of it? No, Mama. Good. Clara put both hands on Lily's shoulders. Because I need you to hear something and remember it. Are you listening? Yes, Mama. People who feel small make themselves feel bigger by deciding that other people are worth less than they are. The things those men said have nothing to do with who you are, who I am, or what we're worth. They have everything to do with who those men are. She looked at her daughter steadily. You understand me? Are you all right? Lily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the careful honesty that was her truest quality, I don't want to leave. I like it here. Clara felt that land in her chest like something heavy and warm. I know, she said. She stood up. She turned back to the stove. She put the chickens in the roasting pan, and she kept working because there was nothing else to do with the thing sitting in her chest except keep working, and she was very good at that. What she didn't do, what she refused to do, was start calculating how to make herself smaller. She had spent too many years of her life trying to take up less space, be less noticeable, ask for less, need less, want less. She had watched that strategy fail her at every turn, had watched it fail every woman she'd ever known who tried it. And she had made a quiet and permanent decision, during the worst weeks after Thomas died, that she was finished with that particular survival tactic. She was here. She was working. Her children were fed and safe, and Mason was learning to ride fence line, and Lily was gathering eggs with an expression of daily triumph, and Samuel had told every single ranch hand that he was helping Mama save the ranch, and none of them had corrected him. She was not going to make herself smaller to accommodate the discomfort of men who had decided she was inconvenient. Supper was on the table at 6 o'clock. Roast chicken with pan gravy, potatoes, cornbread, and a pot of beans that had been going since early morning. The smell had been doing what it always did, drifting across the yard, reaching the bunkhouse, bringing people in with their shoulders, looser than they'd been all day. The table was full and loud, the way it was getting to be now, the looseness of men who had decided they were allowed to look forward to something at the end of the day. Clara was at the serving window when Cole, the quiet one, the man who had decided most things didn't need to be said, walked past the window on his way out after eating and stopped. He stopped and looked at her directly, which was unusual for him. Mrs. Bellamy, he said. Mr. Cole, he seemed to be deciding something. His face went through a brief internal conversation that she didn't have access to, but could watch the outcome of. What those men said at the fence today, he said. She kept her expression steady, so Pete had told them. Or Lily had been overheard. Either way, it was out. It ain't true, Cole said, in case you were wondering if any of us thought it was. He looked at her with that direct, quiet gaze. None of us think it's true. Then he put his hat on and walked out. Clara stood at the serving window for a moment after he was gone. Dolan came by next. He didn't stop walking. He just said, without looking at her, "Cole's right," and kept moving. Roy and Turner came through together. Roy said, "We heard what those fellas said." Turner finished, "They don't speak for Red Hollow." Half the town wouldn't agree with them. Pete, who was last, stopped at the window and looked at her with his young, honest face and said, "I'm sorry I didn't say more to them when they were at the fence, ma'am." "I should have. You didn't owe me anything," Clara said. "No, ma'am," Pete said. "But it was the right thing and I didn't do it fast enough, and I'm sorry for that." She looked at him. "Thank you, Pete," she said. He nodded and left. She stood in the cookhouse for a long time after the bunkhouse quieted. The fire in the stove had burned to coals. The kitchen was clean. The dinner pails were ready for morning. She was bone-tired in the way she got sometimes when the day had required her to hold too much. And she was allowing herself 10 minutes of it, 10 minutes of sitting on the stool in the corner of the cookhouse, with her hands in her lap and her eyes closed, not sleeping. Just being still when she heard the main house door, and then footsteps on the yard. Caleb knocked on the open cookhouse door, even though it was open. She opened her eyes. He stood in the doorway looking at her, not the kitchen, not the shelves, not the fire. At her, and she could see in his face that he already knew about the men at the fence. "Elias told me," he said. "It's handled," she said. Clara. It was the first time he had used her given name. He seemed to realize it at the same moment she did, and he didn't take it back and she didn't react to it, and both of them let it stand in the space between them like something that had been true for longer than either of them had admitted. "I'm sorry that happened," he said. "It was going to happen," she said. "You warned me it would. I'm not surprised and I'm not broken." "I know you're not broken." He came into the cookhouse properly and stood at the counter, not pacing, not performing distress, just standing. Being present. "I want you to know that what Briggs said this afternoon, the implication of it, I don't accept it. This is my ranch and the arrangements on it are mine to make, and your being here is not a thing I'm going to apologize for or explain to anyone." "Including the bank," she said. "Including the bank." She looked at him. "That's a considerable position to take when the bank holds your loan." "Yes," he said simply. "It is." The silence stretched between them again, that particular silence that was becoming familiar, that had its own weight and warmth. "The cattle sale," she said. "When does it need to happen?" He frowned slightly. "Why? Because I have been thinking about the October deadline, since Pete told me about it 2 days ago, and I have been thinking about what an operation this size needs to do between now and then to make that sale successful. And I think you might be working with less information than I have about what's happening in this bunkhouse." Caleb stared at her. "Pete told you." Pete is 19 and has not yet learned the difference between sharing information helpfully and sharing it indiscriminately. Don't be hard on him for it. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Then, what information do you have?" "The men are working," she said. "They're working harder than they have been because they feel like they're working for something rather than just against the slow failure of it. That's not a small thing. That's the difference between a ranch that makes its sale deadline and one that doesn't. I know that. But do you know that Elias has been here 9 years and has never once felt like the work he did in the kitchen was noticed? That Dolan spent a whole day in the east pasture with no food and didn't say a word about it because he was too accustomed to being overlooked. That Cole hasn't spoken more than 3 sentences at supper in a month and spoke 6 tonight." Caleb looked at her. "People don't work for wages," Clara said. "Not really. They work for the feeling that what they do matters and that somebody sees them doing it. You've been so focused on the money problem that you've been running the ranch from the ledger rather than from the yard." The words were direct and she knew it. She watched to see how he received them. He was quiet for a long time. His jaw worked. Something moved behind his eyes that was complicated, not anger, not defense, but the specific expression of a person being told a true thing they'd known somewhere under everything else and had been too exhausted to surface. "My father ran this ranch differently," he said. "He knew every man's name before he knew their wage. He ate in the bunkhouse 3 nights a week." He stopped. I got busy keeping the books honest, and somewhere in there I stopped doing the rest of it." "You can do both," Clara said. He looked at her. "Is that what you've been doing, managing my men for me?" "I've been cooking for your men," she said without heat. "What they do with a full stomach is their own business." The ghost of that almost smile moved across his face again. "Clara," he said, and again the name came out the way it had the first time, not a slip, not an accident, something that had decided to stop waiting for permission. She looked at him. He seemed to lose hold of whatever he'd been about to say. He looked away, looked at the coals in the stove, and then back at her, and she could see him choosing. "I want to ask you something," he said. She waited. "When you came to this ranch, when you walked through that gate, did you know it was in trouble?" "I knew from the look of the yard," she said. "Anyone would have." "And you stayed anyway. I needed the work. Is that the only reason?" Clara looked at him for a moment. The cookhouse was very quiet. Outside, the Montana night was doing what it always did, filling up with stars and cricket sound, and the distant low sound of cattle. "No," she said. It wasn't the only reason. She did not elaborate. She held his gaze and she let that be the answer, which was braver than she'd expected it to feel. Caleb nodded slowly, as though she had confirmed something he'd needed confirmed. He was at the door when everything changed. He turned back just slightly, the way a person turns back when they've almost left. But something stops them, and said, "Elias said something to me tonight." "What did he say?" "He said this ranch smells like it used to smell when his wife was still alive." He paused. "He said he'd forgotten that smell could come back." Clara felt the full weight of that settle into her. She did not trust her voice for a moment. "Good night, Mr. Whitaker," she said finally. "Good night, Clara," he said. He left. She sat back down on the stool in the corner, and she looked at the banked coals in the stove, and she let herself feel, completely and without restraint, the thing she had been carefully not feeling for 5 days. It was not simple what she felt. It was not the easy warmth of a woman falling toward a handsome man. It was bigger than that, and more frightening than that, the feeling of a person who has been holding themselves completely together for a very long time, beginning to understand that there might be someone willing to help hold things. That the burden might not have to be entirely singular, that the ground she was standing on might actually hold. That was the most terrifying thing Clara Bellamy had felt in 8 months. More terrifying than the debt, more terrifying than the landlady. More terrifying than the 11 cents and the 6-mile walk and the men on the porch who'd laughed. Because she could fight those things. She knew how to fight those things. She did not know how to fight hope. She had been protecting herself from it so carefully and for so long that she wasn't sure she remembered what it felt like from the inside. She was still sitting on the stool when Mason appeared in the doorway. He stood there looking at her in the way he sometimes did, serious, watchful, reading the room the way he read everything. "You should be asleep," she said. "I know." He came in and sat on the floor near her feet, the way he used to do when he was younger, before everything that had happened that made him grow up so fast. He leaned against the wall and pulled his knees up. "Mama," he said. Are we going to stay?" She looked at her son, at the serious, hopeful, trying so hard face of him, and she thought about what Lily had said this afternoon. "I don't want to leave. I like it here." She thought about Samuel telling anyone who would listen that he was helping Mama save the ranch. She thought about Mason coming in from fence line with Elias, stiff and sore and trying desperately not to show how proud he was. She thought about Elias Carter saying he forgot what a real supper tasted like. She thought about Caleb Whitaker in this doorway, saying her name for the first time, like it was something he'd decided to stop being careful with. "I don't know yet," she said, not because it was true, but because telling him the whole truth of what she felt would require words she wasn't ready for yet. Mason was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I want to stay. I know, I could help more with the ranch. Elias says I've got good hands." He said, "I know what Elias says." Mason looked at her. "Would that be all right, if we stayed?" Clara put her hand on top of her son's head, briefly, the way she did when he was small, and she wanted him to feel held without making a production of it. "Get some sleep," she said. "We have an early morning." He went. She heard him settle in the back room. She heard Samuel's small sleep sounds and Lily's quiet breathing. The ranch was silent. The fire was down to almost nothing. The night was enormous and still outside. Clara sat alone in the dark of the cookhouse for 3 more minutes, and then she made a decision so quietly she almost didn't notice she was making it. She wasn't going to leave this ranch, not because of Caleb Whitaker. Not because of what she felt toward him, which was something she was not ready to name yet and did not intend to rush. But because this place had needed her, and she had answered that need, and the men in the bunkhouse had needed something they couldn't put words to, and she had provided it. And her children were sleeping soundly in a dry room for the first time since everything fell apart. She was not going to let Harlan Briggs or the people of Red Hollow or anyone else make her retreat from the first solid ground she'd found since Thomas died. She was going to get up at 5 in the morning and build that fire and make that coffee and cook that breakfast. And she was going to do it the next morning and the morning after that. And if October 1st came and the bank came and the worst happened, she would face that then. But she was not going to run, not from this. She stood up, stretched her back, checked the fire one last time, and went to her children. What she did not know, what she could not have known in that moment of private, careful resolve, was that the worst was not waiting until October. The worst had already been set in motion, and it was coming far sooner than anyone on Blackthorn Creek Ranch was prepared for. She found out on a Friday, not from Caleb, not from Elias. Not from Pete, who had already proven himself incapable of keeping significant information to himself for longer than 48 hours. She found out from a woman named Margaret Holt, who arrived at the ranch gate on a buckboard with her husband and a covered basket, and the particular expression of a person who believed they were doing a kindness while actually doing something considerably more complicated. Clara had seen Margaret in Red Hollow the previous Friday, when Caleb had taken her for provisions as he'd promised. She was the wife of the dry goods merchant, a thin woman in her 50s with a quick, precise manner and eyes that missed very little. She had been polite in the store, courteous even. Clara had not read anything concerning into it. She read something concerning into the buckboard. Mrs. Bellamy, Margaret said, climbing down before her husband had fully stopped the horse. She was carrying the basket already, which meant she'd been holding it ready for the last mile at least. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Of course not," Clara said. She was at the pump, washing her hands before starting dinner preparations. She dried them on her apron. "Can I help you with something, Mrs. Holt?" "I brought some preserves," Margaret said, "and some dried cherries. I thought, well, with children, I thought they might appreciate something sweet." "That's very kind." Clara looked at the basket and then at Margaret's face. "Come inside." She poured coffee. She put the preserves on the shelf. She let Margaret sit at the cookhouse table and look around at the organized kitchen and the children's belongings hanging on the pegs and the evidence of a household that had settled itself into a space and made it real. Margaret's hands around her coffee cup were not quite still. "I want to speak plainly with you," Margaret said. "If you'll permit it." "I prefer plain speaking," Clara said. "Harlan Briggs has been talking." Margaret looked at her directly. "He's been talking to certain men on the county board. Men who have influence over things like territorial licensing, operating permits for ranch operations, that kind of thing." She paused. "He's building a case, not a legal case exactly, more of a pressure campaign. He wants Caleb Whitaker to sell. He has a buyer arranged. A development company from the east that wants to break this land up into smaller holdings and sell them piecemeal." Clara was very still. "How long has he wanted this?" she said. 2 years, Margaret said. "Since Caleb's father died and Caleb took on the debt to keep the operation running. Briggs has been waiting for the right moment, the right leverage." She stopped. "Your arrival gave him new material. He's been telling people that Caleb's judgment has become compromised. That a man who allows his word was that kind of arrangement on a property under loan obligation is not a man managing his affairs responsibly." Clara felt the full architecture of it come clear in her mind. Not just a banker calling in a loan, A planned campaign, patient and deliberate, using every available tool, including her presence on this ranch, to manufacture the appearance of mismanagement. "What does he need to make the pressure stick?" she said. Margaret looked at her with something that was close to admiration. "You go right to the center of things, don't you?" "I don't have time for the edges. He needs the county board to open a formal inquiry into the ranch's operation. If that happens, it complicates the loan terms, gives the bank legal ground to accelerate the payment schedule. Make the full amount due immediately rather than October 1st. How close is he to that? 2 votes on the board. He has one certain. He's working on the second. Margaret set her cup down. I'm telling you this because my husband and I have known Caleb Whitaker since he was 8 years old, and because what Briggs is doing is wrong, and because she stopped. Looked at Clara. And because I've heard what's happened on this ranch in the past week, and I think you deserve to know what you're in the middle of. Clara thought about the decision she'd made 3 nights ago in the dark cookhouse. The quiet, private, completely private decision that she was not going to leave. Who's the second board member, she said. Margaret blinked. Excuse me? The second vote Briggs needs. Who is it? A man named Gerald Pruitt. He owns the feed store on the north end of Red Hollow. He's not corrupt, not exactly, he's cautious. He doesn't want trouble with the bank, because the bank holds a small note on his store. So Briggs is squeezing him too, Clara said, in a manner of speaking. Clara stood up. She needed to move while she thought, and she moved to the stove and checked the fire and then came back. Because there was nothing wrong with the fire, she just needed her hands to do something. Does Caleb know about the board, she said. I don't believe so. Briggs has been careful to keep the county board conversations separate from his direct dealings with Caleb. That way Caleb can't respond to something he doesn't know is happening. The cookhouse was quiet for a moment. Thank you, Clara said. Mrs. Holt. Margaret stood. She put her hand briefly on Clara's arm, a light, deliberate touch, woman to woman, the kind that said more than the words around it. You should know that not everyone in Red Hollow feels the way Briggs and his friends feel about your being here. She picked up her empty cup and set it near the basin. Some of us think Caleb Whitaker has had too much bad luck for too long, and some of us are glad something good is happening on that ranch. She left. Clara stood in the cookhouse alone for 60 seconds. Then she went to find Elias. She found him at the barn, which was where he usually was when he wasn't in the field. Methodical, reliable Elias Carter, who had been at Blackthorn Creek for 9 years and knew everything about how this ranch worked and exactly what it was worth. Mr. Carter, she said, I need to talk to you. He looked at her face and put down what he was holding immediately. That was one of the things she had come to count on about Elias. He read situations accurately and didn't waste time arguing with what he read. Tell me, he said. She told him all of it. Margaret Holt's visit, the county board, Gerald Pruitt, the development company, the accelerated payment threat. She told it in the flat, organized way she had when the information was serious, no drama, no emphasis beyond what the facts themselves carried. Elias listened without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. Pruitt, he said. Gerald Pruitt, you know him? I know he's been trying to expand his feed store for 3 years and can't get favorable terms on materials, because the one supplier in the territory has a price-fixing arrangement with the cattleman's bank. He looked at her. Meaning Briggs has been squeezing Pruitt for years before this. Pruitt's not going to vote with Briggs because he wants to. He's going to vote with Briggs because he's been made to feel like he has no other option. Is that true, that he has no other option? Elias thought for a moment. There's a materials supplier out of Helena, smaller operation. They've been trying to get a foothold in this territory, but they can't because the pricing arrangement blocks them out. He looked at Clara. If Pruitt had access to that supplier, if someone made the introduction, his situation with the bank becomes considerably less urgent. Does Caleb know the Helena supplier? He's done business with them for fence materials. 2 years back, Clara looked at Elias steadily. We need to tell Caleb. Yes, Elias said. We do. He paused. He's in the north field. I'll get him. Get him now, Clara said. She went back to the cookhouse and started dinner preparations because there were 8 men to feed at 6 o'clock regardless of what else was happening, and she needed her hands busy while her mind worked. She was deep in it, the thinking and the chopping and the problem and the planning all running together when she heard Mason come in from wherever he'd been and stop at the sight of her face. "Mama," he said. "It's all right," she said. "Go find Lily and stay close to the cookhouse this afternoon." Mason didn't move. Is the ranch in trouble? She looked at her son. She thought about the 10-year-old boy who had been trying to be a man since the day they carried his father out of a Montana farmhouse on a bitter October morning. "The ranch has a problem," she said. "We're working on it." "Can I help?" She looked at him for a moment longer than usual. Then she said yes. "As a matter of fact, I need you to go to the main house and look through the desk in the front room for any papers that say Helena on them. Business correspondence, supply agreements, anything like that. Mr. Whitaker will tell you it's all right. He's on his way back now." Mason was already moving before she finished the sentence. Caleb arrived 20 minutes later, still in his work coat, with the controlled expression of a man who had been handed difficult information and was refusing to show the full weight of it on his face. He came to the cookhouse. He stood across the work table from Clara, and she could see him processing the county board. The 2 votes, Gerald Pruitt, the development company, all of it moving behind his eyes with the speed of a man whose mind worked fast when it had to. "Briggs has been planning this for 2 years, Caleb said. It came out quiet and certain, not a question. The loan was always a mechanism, Clara said. He just needed the right conditions to use it." Caleb's jaw was tight. "And the arrangement here, with you and the children. He's using that. He's using everything available to him," Clara said. "That's one piece of it. The board inquiry is the real threat. Because it gives him legal grounds to accelerate the payment." "Yes, and if the full amount comes due immediately." "There's no way to meet it," Caleb said. He was looking at the table, not at her. "Not without the cattle sale, and the cattle sale isn't until August." He stopped. "We can't make a July payment of the full amount." "Then we need Gerald Pruitt," Clara said. Caleb looked up at her. "Elias explained the situation," she said. "Pruitt isn't Briggs's man. He's Briggs's hostage. If we give him a way out of that situation before the board vote, he doesn't vote with Briggs." "The Helena supplier," Caleb said slowly. "You have a contact there?" "I do." He straightened. Something shifted in his posture, the shift of a man who has found a direction to move in and is already moving. "I can write a letter today. Introduce Pruitt to my contact, recommend terms, facilitate the arrangement. Can you do it in a way that doesn't look like you're buying his vote?" Caleb looked at her. "I'd be doing him a genuine business favor." "I know that. Make sure he knows it too. Make sure the letter is about his situation, not about yours." He stared at her. "You think like a general," he said. "I think like a woman who's been fighting uphill for a long time," she said. Same result. Mason appeared in the cookhouse door at that moment with a handful of papers. "I found the Helena correspondence," he said. He looked at Caleb. "You said a man named Robert Aldous. He wrote back in May of '84 about pricing agreements. This one," he held up a page. "This one mentions terms for future arrangements." Caleb stared at his 10-year-old cook's son, holding the exact documents he needed. Clara looked at Mason. "Good work," she said. "Set them on the table and go help Lily." Mason set the papers on the table with careful precision and left. Caleb looked at the papers and then at the door Mason had just walked through. "He found those in 10 minutes, he said. He's thorough," Clara said. Caleb picked up the papers. He read them quickly, scanning with the practiced eye of a man who spent considerable time with documents. Then he set them down and looked at Clara with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something open and direct and without any of the careful management he usually kept in place. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. "I need to say something to you." "Write the letter first," she said. "Clara, Caleb." She said his name the same way he'd said hers without making a production of it, just setting it down plain. "Write the letter first. Save the ranch, then say what you need to say." He looked at her for a long moment, then he picked up the papers. He wrote the letter that afternoon. Elias wrote it to Red Hollow himself, to Pruitt's feed store, and handed it to Gerald Pruitt in person and waited while Pruitt read it. According to Elias, who returned 2 hours before supper, with the particular expression of a man who had done a good day's work and knew it, Pruitt had read the letter twice, looked up at Elias, and said, "Tell Mr. Whitaker I appreciate the introduction." And then he said, "Tell him I've got business in Billings this week. I won't be at the county board meeting." Elias had tipped his hat and left. A county board meeting required a quorum. Without Pruitt, there was no quorum. Without a quorum, there was no formal inquiry. Without a formal inquiry, Harlan Briggs had exactly what he'd started with alone, with an October 1st payment date and a ranch that, as of this particular Friday, was in considerably better shape than it had been 3 weeks ago. Elias delivered the news to Clara at the serving window when he came through for his supper. He said it quietly, between the cornbread and the beans, in the matter-of-fact tone of a man reporting a fence repaired. Clara kept ladling. She did not stop moving or show anything on her face, because the bunkhouse was full and loud, and this was not the moment for the feeling that was rising in her chest relief so enormous and physical it felt like her whole body exhaling something it had been holding for longer than 5 days. She got through supper. She got through cleanup. She got through Samuel's bath and Lily's reading, and Mason's brief businesslike report on what he'd observed during the afternoon. Delivered with the dignity of someone who understood he'd played a meaningful role in something. She sent the children to bed. She sat down. She had been sitting for approximately 4 minutes when Caleb knocked on the open cookhouse door. She looked up. He stood there in the lamplight, and he was not composed the way he usually was, not unraveled exactly, but the careful management was absent. He looked like himself, the underneath version of himself, the one she'd been seeing in small glimpses over the past week. He came in without being invited, which was new, and stood at the table. "Elias told me what you did," he said, "with Margaret Holt." "With the information. With Mason and the Helena papers." "Elias did most of it," Clara said. "Clara, you made the connection with Pruitt. The letter was yours. You thought of it." He looked at her steadily. "You thought of all of it. You walked into a conversation Margaret Holt brought to your cookhouse, and you built a strategy in an afternoon that—" He stopped. "Clara, why?" She looked at him. "Why did you fight for this ranch like that?" he said. "You could have packed your children and gone. You had reason enough with Briggs and the town talking. You could have left, and nobody would have blamed you." She was quiet for a moment. "You gave my children something," she said. "This ranch, these people, Mason has a reason to get up in the morning. Lily has hens she cares about. Samuel told Pete yesterday that the ranch is his. He's 4 years old, Caleb, and he said this ranch is his." She stopped. "I will not let a banker in a development company take that from my children." Caleb was looking at her with the full weight of his attention, the kind of attention she had not been looked at with, in a very long time, not examined, not assessed, not measured against some expectation she hadn't been told about. Just looked at, completely, as though she was the whole of what he was thinking about. "I love you," he said. The cookhouse was completely still. He said it the same way he said everything, directly, without rehearsal, without softening or hedging it into something easier to land on. He said it and let it stand. Clara looked at him. She thought about Thomas and the life she'd built with him, and what it had felt like to love someone who loved you back before grief had taken the shape of that thing and made it impossible to touch. She thought about 8 months of holding everything alone. She thought about 11 cents and a 6-mile walk, and the sound of a room full of lonely men discovering that a hot meal could remind them what belonging felt like. She thought about a man who had told her about his loan before she'd been on his ranch for 48 hours, who had said her name like it was a decision, who had written a letter that morning, not to save himself, but to free someone else from a trap. "I know," she said. It was not a small answer. She meant it to be the fullness of one. He came around the table and he stood in front of her, close enough that she had to look up at him, and he said, "Is that all you'll give me right now?" "I have 3 children asleep in the next room," she said. I know that, and a ranch with an October deadline. I know that too. And she stopped. She started again. I have not let myself want something for 8 months. I am going to need a moment to trust the ground. Caleb Whitaker looked at her for a long time. Then he reached out and took her hand, both of them still standing. The table between them moved aside, and he held it with the same deliberate care he gave everything. And he said, I'm not going anywhere. I know, she said again. He did not push for more than that. He held her hand, and the cookhouse lamp burned low, and the ranch was quiet outside, and Clara Bellamy stood in a kitchen she had built out of a ruin, in a place her children had already decided was theirs, and she felt the ground hold. Not perfectly, not without risk, but hold. 3 days later he asked her properly. Not in the cookhouse, not in the barn or the yard or any of the places that had become part of the daily geography of this thing between them. He asked her in the evening after supper, when the men had gone back to the bunkhouse and the children were inside, and the yard was theirs for just a few minutes. He stood in front of her, and he held his hat, and he said, I know I'm asking you to take on a ranch with a debt and a banker who doesn't like us, and a town that's still making up its mind about what to think. Yes, she said. I know I'm asking you to trust that what I feel. Caleb, I'm not done. She waited. I know I'm asking you to marry a man who spent so long staring at ledgers that he forgot to look up and see what was happening in his own yard. And I know you have 3 children who have already lost one father, and who deserve a man who stopped. His jaw moved. Who deserves them? Clara looked at him. Are you asking me? She said. I'm asking you, he said. Will you marry me, Clara? She had thought about this moment. She had not admitted to herself that she'd been thinking about it, but she had in the way she thought about things she was not ready to name, peripherally, carefully, in the margins of everything else. And she had thought about what she would need to know before she could answer. Ask my children, she said. He blinked. If you're asking me, she said, you're asking all of us. My children have to be part of this choice, so ask them. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. He turned toward the cookhouse door. Mason was standing in it. Clara did not know how long he'd been there. From the expression on his face, she suspected it had been long enough. Caleb looked at the boy for a moment and then said, with perfect directness, Mason, I'm asking your mother to marry me. I need to know what you think. Mason's face was unreadable for a long second. He did the thing he always did, absorbed it, measured it, took it seriously. Then he said, you teach me things like I'm worth teaching. You are worth teaching, Caleb said. My father used to say that too, Mason said. He meant it. So do I. Mason looked at him for another long moment. Then he looked at his mother. Then he looked back at Caleb Whitaker, and he said, I think it's all right. Coming from Mason, at that age, in that tone, it was everything. Lily appeared beside her brother, because Lily was never far when something important was happening. She looked up at Caleb with the direct, clear evaluation she brought to everything. Do you love my mama? She said. I do, Caleb said. Like really love her? Not just because she's useful? Clara pressed her hand over her mouth. Caleb's expression did something extraordinary. He crouched down to Lily's level, which no adult had ever done for Lily without being prompted, and he looked at her directly and said, Your mama is the most useful woman I have ever known. And that is not why I love her. I love her because she walked into a place that had given up and she refused to give up with it. And because she raised you and your brothers, and anyone who raised you and your brothers is someone extraordinary. Lily considered this with great seriousness. Then she said, okay. Samuel appeared behind both of them, rubbing his eyes, clearly just woken up, with no context whatsoever. What's happening? He said. Mr. Whitaker is going to marry Mama, Lily told him. Samuel looked at Samuel. Do you make pancakes in? Samuel said. There was a silence. Then Caleb said very seriously, I make excellent pancakes. Samuel nodded. Okay, he said. He turned and went back to bed. Clara looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Clara, she said. My answer is yes. He stood up. He looked at her with that open, underneath himself expression, the one without the careful management. And he said, very quietly, thank you. Don't thank me, she said. Just keep your word." "On my life," he said. Mason slipped back inside. Lily followed, looking satisfied in the way she looked when outcomes confirmed her assessments. The yard was quiet again. Caleb stepped close to her. He took her face in both hands, calloused, work-honest hands. The hands of a man who had spent years holding things together by himself, and he looked at her for a long moment, like she was something he had not dared to believe in and had turned out to be real. He kissed her, once, with the same deliberateness he gave to everything. When he pulled back, she looked at him and said, "October 1st. He laughed a real laugh, the first real laugh she'd heard from him, and it was a good sound, the kind of sound a man made when the weight had lifted enough to let the breath back in. October 1st, he agreed. The Montana night sat around them, vast and dark and full of stars, and Blackthorn Creek Ranch was quiet and whole and, for the first time in a long time, pointing toward something, rather than away from it. The morning after Caleb asked her, Clara woke up before the roosters and lay in the dark for a full minute doing nothing except breathing. That was unusual for her. She was not a woman who lay still. She was a woman who moved, who calculated, who got to the next thing before the last thing had fully settled. 8 months of survival had made stillness feel dangerous, like the moment you stopped moving was the moment that decided to give way. But this morning she lay still, and she breathed, and she let the fact of last night simply exist without immediately fitting it into a plan. She was going to marry Caleb Whitaker. Her children had said yes, each in their own particular language, which was the only language that mattered. The ranch had an October deadline and a banker who despised them, and a town that was still sorting out its opinion. None of that had changed. But this morning, in the dark, before the cookhouse fire and the coffee and the 8 men who needed breakfast, Clara Bellamy allowed herself 30 seconds of something she had nearly forgotten the texture of. Hope, plain, unguarded, unreasonable hope. Then she got up and built the fire. She did not tell the children to keep the engagement quiet. She did not instruct anyone to manage the information carefully. She simply went about the morning in the way she always did, and by the time breakfast was on the table and the men were filing in, something in the quality of the yard had already shifted the way weather, shifted before anyone could name what was coming. A change in pressure, in light, in the way people moved through space. Elias Carter noticed first. He always noticed first. He sat down across from Pete, accepted his coffee from Mason without looking at it, and looked at Clara at the serving window with the steady, measuring gaze of a man who had spent 9 years watching this ranch and knew every variation of its mood. He said nothing. He drank his coffee. He watched Caleb walk in from the main house, which was not Caleb's usual habit. Eating in the bunkhouse and take a seat at the end of the table and accept a plate from Clara's hands without any of the formal distance that had characterized every previous interaction between them in front of the men. Elias set his cup down. Well, he said to no one in particular. Pete looked up, looked at Caleb, looked at Clara, looked back at Elias. Well, what? Nothing, Elias said. He picked up his fork and the corners of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but was in the same family. It was Roy who said it outright, because Roy had never in his life left a thing unsaid that could be said. "Mr. Whitaker," Roy said, about halfway through breakfast, in the tone of a man who had decided the room needed someone to speak plainly. "You're eating in the bunkhouse." Caleb looked at him. "I am. You haven't eaten in the bunkhouse in 14 months. Not since your pa's funeral supper." The table was quiet. Caleb looked at Clara through the serving window. Clara looked back at him and said nothing, because this was his choice to make, this moment, and she was not going to make it for him. Caleb set his fork down. He looked at the table at Elias and Pete and Roy and Turner and Dolan and Hank and Cole, the 8 men who had stayed when they could have left, who had worked harder than anyone had asked them to, because a woman had come and reminded them what it felt like to be cared for, and he said, "I asked Mrs. Bellamy to marry me last night." The bunkhouse was absolutely silent. Then Pete made a sound that was entirely undignified and immediately covered his mouth. Roy looked at Turner. Turner looked at Roy. They both looked at Caleb. "She said yes." "She said yes," Caleb confirmed. Roy and Turner erupted simultaneously, Roy with a whoop that rattled the coffee cups, and Turner with a fist on the table that made the plates jump. Pete abandoned all pretense of composure and simply hollered. Hank, who had spoken approximately 40 words in the entire time Clara had been at the ranch, stood up and extended his hand across the table to Caleb and said, "Good man," which from Hank was the equivalent of a speech. Dolan looked at Clara through the serving window. He looked at her for a long moment with that closed, careful face. Then he nodded one slow, deliberate nod and looked back at his plate. Cole said nothing, but he looked at Clara with the full directness of his usually private gaze, and in it she read everything he wasn't going to say, which was considerable. Elias waited until the noise had settled. Then he looked at Caleb and said, "Your father would have liked her." The bunkhouse went quiet in a different way, the way it went quiet when something true had been said that was too big for noise. Caleb looked at Elias for a moment. Something moved in his face that Clara had not seen before, not grief exactly, but the particular tenderness that lived right next to grief. The tenderness of a man thinking about a person he loved, who was no longer there to see what his life was becoming. "I know," Caleb said. Elias picked up his coffee. "Then let's get to work," he said. "That cattle herd isn't going to condition itself." The table laughed. The moment passed. Plates were cleared and boots were pulled on, and the day began, and Clara stood at the serving window, watching it happen, and felt the particular warmth of being in a room where people were genuinely glad about something. Lily appeared at her elbow. "They're happy," she observed. "They are," Clara said. "Because of you and Mr. Whitaker?" "Because of a lot of things that all happened together." Lily thought about this with her usual seriousness. "I think it's mostly because of you," she said, and then she went to collect the hen's eggs, before Clara could respond to that. What happened over the following 3 weeks was the kind of thing that was hard to explain to anyone who hadn't been at Blackthorn Creek Ranch, to see it happen in real time, the way a place that had been slowly losing its will found it again all. At once, the way the engagement between two peoples somehow became a declaration that the ranch itself was going to survive. The men worked with an intensity that had nothing to do with obligation. They worked the way people worked when they believed in the outcome, not desperately, not frantically, but with a focused, quiet drive that built on itself every day. The cattle condition improved steadily. The fences were in the best shape they'd been in 3 years, according to Elias. The equipment that had been sitting half-repaired for months was finished properly by the people who knew how to do it. Caleb rode out every morning and rode back in the evenings with the particular look of a man who is watching something he built come back to life. And every evening he came to the cookhouse, not as the ranch owner checking on his cook, but as a man coming home. That distinction, quiet as it was, changed everything. Clara noticed the shift in the men when they saw it. The way they stopped treating the space between the main house and the cookhouse as a formal divide. The way the meals started feeling less like an employer and employees arrangement and more like something that had a different name, a word that Clara didn't want to push on too quickly. Because she'd learned the hard way that naming things too soon was a good way to frighten them off. But she thought the word. She thought it every night when she checked the fire and listened to her children breathing in the next room and heard Caleb's lamp go on in the main house across the yard. Family. The word was family. It was not a replacement for what had been. Thomas Bellamy was still real, was still the man who had taught Mason to stack wood so it held, who had named Lily after his grandmother, who had called Samuel his morning surprise because the boy had arrived in February during a snowstorm. Thomas was still loved and still mourned, and would always be both. But family was not a finite thing, Clara had decided. It did not have a limited quantity. It grew when it was given room to grow. She was giving it room. The first serious problem came on a Tuesday morning, 12 days before the wedding. She was starting breakfast when Mason came in from the yard with a face that told her something had happened before he said a word. "There's a man at the gate," Mason said. "He's not from around here." Clara looked at him. "What kind of man?" Mason said. "Nice horse, not Briggs." Clara dried her hands. "Where's Miss Whitaker?" already out in the Northfield with Elias. She went to the gate herself. The man at the gate was perhaps 45, with the particular look of someone who worked in an office and had recently been required to be outdoors, which was not a situation he was fully comfortable with. He had a leather satchel and a document in his hand, and the expression of a person delivering something he wished someone else had been assigned to deliver. "Mrs. Bellamy," he said. She was surprised he knew her name. "That's right. My name is Arthur Fenn. I'm a legal representative for the Cattlemen's Bank of Red Hollow." He held out document. "I've been asked to deliver this to the property." Clara looked at the document without touching it. "What is it?" "It's a notice of formal inquiry," Fenn said. He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "Into the operating conditions of Blackthorn Creek Ranch." "The county board. The county board requires a quorum," Clara said. "Gerald Pruitt was unavailable for the last meeting." Fenn blinked. "There was a special session called," he said. 2 days ago, Mr. Pruitt was in attendance." Clara felt the cold certainty of it land in her chest. Briggs had not given up. He had simply waited until the angle changed, waited until Pruitt returned from Billings, found another piece of pressure to apply, called a special session that nobody at Blackthorn Creek had known to watch for. She took the document. She looked at it, the formal language, the county seal, the signatures. It was real. It was official. It meant that the bank had legal grounds to request a review of the loan terms, which meant the acceleration clause was now in play, which meant the October 1st deadline might no longer be October 1st. "When does this take effect?" she said. "The inquiry hearing is set for August 14th, Fenn said." 2 weeks. 2 weeks before the cattle sale. She looked at Arthur Fenn. He had the face of a man who was doing a job he hadn't designed and didn't particularly endorse. "Fenn," she said, "can I ask you something directly?" "Ma'am, is this Harlan Briggs's doing, or is this the board's genuine concern about the operation of this ranch?" Fenn was quiet for a moment. He looked at his horse. Then he looked back at her. "I am not in a position to characterize Mr. Briggs's motivations," he said, very carefully, very precisely. Which was its own answer. "Thank you for coming in person," Clara said. "I appreciate that." He tipped his hat, remounted, and rode back toward Red Hollow. Clara stood at the gate with the document in her hand. Mason was beside her. She had not heard him come up. "Bad," he said. "Complicated. Go get Caleb." "Tell him to come in from the Northfield." Mason ran. She went back to the cookhouse. She put the document on the table. She finished making breakfast because the men needed to eat and the world needed to keep moving, and standing still had never once solved a problem in her life. By the time the food was on the table, Caleb was in the yard. He read the document at the cookhouse table, standing, still in his work coat. She watched him read it, the controlled stillness of him, the way he processed bad news without broadcasting it, which was something she had come to understand, was one of the truest things about his character. He set the document down. He looked at her. 2 weeks, he said. The hearing is August 14th. The cattle sale is August 28th. If the inquiry accelerates the payment, I know, she said. I've been thinking about it since the gate, and... She sat down across from him. She had been thinking about it for 25 minutes, which was long enough for her to reach the part of the problem that mattered. Briggs doesn't actually want an inquiry, she said. An inquiry is work. It requires documentation, witnesses, a formal proceeding. Briggs is a man who wants results without the labor of earning them. Caleb looked at her. Keep going. He wants you to settle, she said. He called this inquiry because he's hoping that the threat of it, the acceleration clause, the timeline pressure will make you decide it's not worth fighting. He's hoping you'll approach him and negotiate a sale before the hearing date. Caleb was very still. He's been trying to make you feel like the only move available is the one he's chosen for you, Clara said. Everything he's done, the visit, the comments about the arrangement here, the county board pressure, it's all been designed to make you feel cornered. Because a cornered man makes desperate decisions. And you're telling me I'm not cornered, Caleb said. I'm telling you the hearing is 2 weeks away. And there are things that can happen in 2 weeks, she said. The question is what we do with them. He looked at her for a long moment. What do you want to do? She looked back at him. I want to go talk to Gerald Pruitt myself. The silence stretched. Claire, I know, she said. You wrote him a letter. You did him a genuine business favor. And Briggs still found enough pressure to bring him back into the vote. She put her hands flat on the table. Which means Briggs is holding something over Pruitt that we don't know about yet. And the only way to find out what it is to ask him, Caleb finished. Man to man, you've already been gracious to him, Clara said. Sometimes a different kind of conversation requires a different kind of voice. Caleb looked at her. He doesn't know you. No, she said. He knows what Briggs told him about me. A widow with 3 children and no business being on a decent man's ranch. She held his gaze. Let him meet the actual woman and decide for himself. The silence between them was not hesitation. It was Caleb understanding what she was proposing and deciding whether he trusted her to do it. She watched him arrive at the answer. I'll take you tomorrow morning, he said. Gerald Pruitt's feed store on the north end of Red Hollow was a working establishment, not prosperous, but solid. The kind of business that had been built over many years of careful management and was being maintained now by a man who was tired of fighting for it. Pruitt himself was 60, white-haired, with the weathered hands of someone who had started physical work early and never fully left it behind even when he'd moved into commerce. He looked at Clara when she walked in with Caleb, and he had the expression of a man who had been told one thing about a person and was now being asked to recalibrate. Clara let him look. She was used to that, Mr. Pruitt, Caleb said. This is my fiancée, Clara Bellamy. Pruitt extended his hand. His grip was firm and honest, which told her something. Mrs. Bellamy, he said. Thank you for seeing us, Clara said. I know you didn't have to. Caleb Whitaker did me a genuine kindness with the Helena introduction, Pruitt said. He looked between them both. I'm not a man who forgets that. But you voted for the special session, Clara said. Directly, without softening it. She had decided in the wagon on the way here that directness was the only thing that would work with a man like this. Pruitt looked at her steadily. I did. What did Briggs use? She said. Pruitt was quiet for a moment. He looked at Caleb, then back at Clara. Something moved in his face, not guilt exactly, but the expression of a man who has been carrying something alone and is deciding whether to set it down. There's a lien, he said, on this building. I didn't know about it when I bought the property 12 years ago. Briggs found it or claims to have found it, a prior claim from before my purchase. He's been holding it over me for 2 years. He stopped. He told me if I didn't vote for the special session, he'd file to enforce it. I'd lose the store. Clara said, is the lien legitimate? He says it is. Have you had anyone else examine it? Pruitt's jaw moved. I couldn't afford to fight it even if I had someone examine it. What if you could? Clara said. He looked at her. There's a territorial land office in Helena, she said. All prior property claims are registered there. If the lien Briggs is holding over you is legitimate, it will be on record and correctly filed. If it's not, she paused. If it was manufactured or incorrectly filed or past its enforcement period, a territorial records clerk can tell you that in an afternoon. Pruitt stared at her. How do you know about territorial land records? Because a man used one to take my farm after my husband died, she said. I spent 3 weeks trying to understand what had happened, and what I learned was that those records work in both directions. They can be used against a person, and they can be used to protect one. The feed store was very quiet. I didn't know Briggs had manufactured this, Caleb said. His voice was controlled and even, but Clara could hear the particular cold steadiness underneath it that meant he was furious in the precise, directed way of a man who did not let anger make him careless. I want you to know that. Pruitt looked at him. I believe you. I'll write to the Helena land office today, Caleb said. Request a full review of your property records, whatever it costs. That's not something I can let you pay for, Pruitt said. It's not charity, Clara said. It's evidence. If Briggs manufactured a lien to force a county pine board vote that then enabled him to pursue a fraudulent pressure campaign against a legitimate ranch operation, that's not a civil matter, Mr. Pruitt. That's criminal fraud. And the person who stands up and says so is the person who was threatened with it. Pruitt looked at her for a long time. "You're something else, Mrs. Bellamy," he said finally, almost wondering. "I'm a woman who's had things taken from her by men who thought the paperwork gave them the right," she said. "I'm familiar with the type." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "I'll withdraw my vote from the special session record. I'll tell the board I was operating under duress." He straightened. "And I'll sign whatever statement your lawyer needs about how Briggs approached me." Caleb extended his hand. "Thank you, Gerald." Pruitt shook it. He looked at Clara. "You take care of this man," he said. "That's not actually how I plan to approach the marriage," Clara said pleasantly. "But I appreciate the sentiment." Pruitt laughed a real laugh, surprised out of him, and it was the best sound the north end of Red Hollow had produced in some time. What followed in the next 10 days moved with the speed of things that had been too long delayed and were now finally permitted to arrive. Pruitt's sworn statement went to the territorial circuit judge in Helena. The judge, who had been aware of Harlan Briggs's operating methods for several years without having sufficient grounds to act, found the statement more than sufficient. A review of the Cattlemen's Bank's recent land record inquiries revealed that the lien on Pruitt's property had been filed by Briggs himself through a shell instrument. 8 years ago, not a legitimate prior claim but a manufactured one, created precisely as a tool of future leverage. That was fraud. Federal-level fraud given the territorial land records involved. Briggs was informed of the investigation on a Wednesday. By Thursday, he had withdrawn the inquiry notice against Blackthorn Creek Ranch entirely, in writing, citing a clerical error in the original filing. By Friday, he had resigned from his position at the Cattlemen's Bank. When Elias read the notice that arrived from the bank, a formal letter confirming that the loan terms stood as originally written, October 1st, and that the bank wished to apologize for any confusion caused by the preceding correspondence, he read it twice, folded it carefully, and walked it to Clara at the cookhouse window. He held it out. She took it, she read it, she handed it back to him. "Put that in the desk in the main house," she said. "In the locked drawer." Elias looked at her. "You're not going to—" He gestured vaguely at the bunkhouse. "Meaning, celebrate. Meaning, tell them. Meaning, let the relief of it out." "At supper," she said. "Caleb should be the one to tell them." Elias nodded slowly. He put the letter under his arm. He was halfway across the yard when he stopped, the way he sometimes did, and turned back. "Ruth would have liked you," he said. "My wife, she would have liked you considerable." Clara looked at him. "Thank you, Elias," she said. It came out quiet and full. He tipped his hat and walked on. Supper that night was the best meal Clara had cooked since arriving at Blackthorn Creek, which was saying something. She had been saving the good flour and the last of the dried currants for exactly the right moment, and this was the moment. Roast beef that had been going since noon, proper gravy, roasted potatoes with herbs from the garden she'd started behind the cookhouse 3 weeks ago, fresh bread, and a currant cake that she had made with the full knowledge that some occasions simply required a cake. When Caleb read the bank's letter aloud at the table, the bunkhouse made a noise that brought Samuel running from the back room to see what was happening, and Samuel, finding the room full of laughing, shouting men, immediately climbed onto the bench beside Pete and shouted along without knowing why, which made everyone laugh harder. Lily sat very straight and looked at Clara with an expression of absolute satisfaction, as though this had always been the inevitable outcome, and she was merely confirming what she'd already known. Mason sat quietly beside Elias and did not shout. He looked at his hands on the table for a moment, and then he looked at Caleb at the head of the table, and then he looked at his mother at the serving window. And something passed over his face that Clara recognized, because she felt it herself, the particular relief of a child who has been holding himself together for a very long time, who has been the man of a family that needed one, who can finally feel the weight of that begin to lift, because someone else has arrived, who is capable and willing to take the part that was always too large for a 10-year-old boy. She held his gaze. He nodded, once, the way he always did when they were communicating something too large for words. She nodded back. They were married on the 14th of August, the date that had been set as the hearing date before everything changed, which Clara privately considered a satisfying reversal in the main house of Blackthorn Creek Ranch, with the circuit preacher from Red Hollow officiating and every hand on the ranch standing in their cleanest shirts. Margaret Holt came with her husband and brought flowers from her garden. Gerald Pruitt came alone and stood at the back and said nothing but stayed for the entire ceremony and the meal that followed. Samuel carried the rings in a small box and dropped one, which rolled under the preacher's boot, which caused a delay of approximately 2 minutes and a considerable amount of suppressed laughter. Lily held her mother's hand during the vows and did not cry, which Clara suspected was an act of significant self-discipline. Mason stood beside Caleb, which was where Caleb had asked him to stand, because Caleb had looked at the boy and said, "I'd like you beside me, if that's all right," and Mason had said, "Yes, sir," in the voice he used when he was moved and did not intend to show it. When the preacher said the words, Clara looked at Caleb Whitaker and felt the full weight and reality of what she had chosen, not the fantasy of it, not the relief of it, but the actual, daily, imperfect, irreplaceable thing itself. A man who told her the truth even when it complicated things. A man who crouched down to speak to a 7-year-old girl at her own level. A man who had been losing his ranch and losing himself in the losing of it, and who had let a woman with 3 children and 11 cents walk into his cookhouse and change the direction of everything. She said yes when the preacher asked. She meant all of it. After the meal which Clara had cooked herself, because some things a woman needed to do with her own hands, she found herself alone at the cookhouse window for exactly 3 minutes, while the yard filled with voices and the bunkhouse and the main house were lit up together, indistinguishable from each other in the warm summer evening. She looked at the yard she had first walked into 6 weeks ago. The untidy, discouraged, quietly dying yard of a ranch that had forgotten what it was fighting for. She looked at Elias telling a story to Gerald Pruitt with the animated authority of a man who has earned the right to hold the room. She looked at Pete teaching Samuel some sort of complicated hand motion that Samuel kept getting wrong, and that both of them found endlessly hilarious. She looked at Cole, who was sitting on the porch step beside Lily, apparently having what appeared to be a genuine and serious conversation, Lily's most focused expression, Cole's rare direct engagement. 2 people who recognized in each other a kindred preference for saying things that actually mattered. She looked at Mason. He was standing next to Caleb in the middle of the yard. Caleb was pointing at something in the direction of the north field, explaining something, the fence line, she thought, or the cattle rotation, or the particular configuration of the pasture that Caleb was always thinking about. And Mason was listening with every part of himself, the way he listened when something genuinely interested him, the way he had listened to his father once. As she watched, Caleb put his hand briefly on the back of Mason's neck, the light, easy gesture of a man claiming something not as territory but as belonging, and Mason did not pull away or stiffen or look for permission. He leaned into it, just slightly, just enough. Clara turned back to the window and looked at the cookhouse she had built out of an abandoned ruin. The clean shelves and organized stores and the herbs drying near the window and the marks on the doorframe where Mason had started measuring his height every week because this was a place they were staying. She had walked through that gate with nothing except her children and the determination of the ground. I bet it was going to hold her, whether it felt like it or not. The ground had held, and Blackthorn Creek Ranch, the ranch that had forgotten what home felt like, that had been one banker's scheme and one bad October away from being broken apart and sold for pieces, stood whole and warm and loud with life in the Montana summer evening. Caleb appeared at the cookhouse door. He looked at her at the window. He crossed the room and stood beside her and looked out at the yard with her. And neither of them said anything for a moment, because the yard was saying it for them. Then he said, "Happy?" "Yes," she said. No hesitation, no qualification, no careful management of the word to protect herself from the size of it. Just yes. He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and they stood together at the window of the cookhouse that had started everything, the cold ruin of it. The broken stove and empty shelves, and the smell of a place that had given up, and they looked at what it had become. Some things Clara Bellamy had learned could not be rebuilt from the outside. No amount of money or effort or good intention applied from a distance could put life back into something that had gone hollow. The only thing that worked was someone walking in and refusing to treat it like it was already dead. She had walked in, she had refused, and Blackthorn Creek Ranch was not a dying place anymore. It was exactly what it had always been meant to be, a home, full of people who had chosen each other, on solid ground that was going to hold.